I think you've said so concretely a lot about what phenomenology brings to your practice and to your supervision. But maybe you could just say a little bit more about the existential tradition and phenomenology and how it actually lands in the moment-to-moment therapy exchange.
Okay, I'll try to do that, and you can ask more if I miss the mark. The first thing that I feel like saying actually is that I would say focusing is a phenomenological method.
Sure, absolutely.
I would go as far as to say that focusing is phenomenology, at least in psychotherapy, if not more generally.
Yeah.
So by phenomenology in the therapeutic context, there's three kind of principles of phenomenology as it's often taught in the existential tradition. One is that we stay at the level of description. We don't interpret or analyze, we just describe, which is exactly what we do in focusing. We describe what does it really feel like and come up with a word or an image or something that just describes it, doesn't explain it or interpret it. The second thing is what's called the rule of equalization or horizontalization, where everything is taken as equally valid. We don't have a theory guiding us and saying, look at this, don't look at that, or this is the important movement, that's resistance. So everything is treated equally. And I think we do that in focusing as well, or at least attempt to. We attempt to notice all the different parts or all the different impulses in the person and welcome them and receive them equally. As a therapist, I think, from my point of view at least, we try not to take sides, even if the client is.
Yes.
And because clients will sometimes continue with a bias against a part of themselves. And I think if you're working in this way, at least, the therapist wants to say, well, I hear that. I'm not going to just ignore that. It feels important to me. So let's just have it in some way or something.
Right.
And the third thing is what's called bracketing, where this is what Jean talks about, putting nothing in between. It's where there's the attempt to set down everything that we think we know in order to experience things freshly and to be surprised by what might actually be there. But I think focusing adds a fourth thing that isn't typically taught as part of phenomenology, and that is that it's a process. Phenomenology sometimes, if you're only within the existential world, I would say, it can sometimes seem a bit conceptual. It's like if the client says, I'm feeling guilty. If you want to work phenomenologically but don't know focusing, you might say, what is guilt? Stay at the level of describing the word, the concept. And that can be very useful. I'm not saying that's not useful. But from a focusing point of view, you could say that. But you could also say, so you would assume, perhaps, that the word guilt is pointing at something more than just the word. And there's the invitation of, can you stay with that feeling and even check, is guilt the right term for what it really feels like?
Yes.
And if the person can sense it somehow, then a process happens that I would say is a phenomenological process that you can stay with phenomenologically. That's something that focusing definitely adds to the existential world.
Yes, yes, yes.
Staying with that process of unfolding, and that's the phenomenological process.
Yeah, there are two things there that you're saying. One of them is that the phenomenology doesn't maybe have explicitly the depth of going to this level of the sensing into what's there now. It could be just what's there now in the explicit level rather than on the implicit level. And it's so different to say, what is guilt, than to say, what is that guilt that's there right now? How does that come to you? Or something that's inviting the person to go into the pond of that huge thing that's called guilt. As you did when you said, is guilt the right word? What does that word mean to you right now? But that whole sensing into is such an important dimension of therapy that that focusing makes much more accessible and spelled out, that that's what we're doing, that we're sensing into what's there right now. So the right now, that depth that you were talking about in part one of our dialogue, that focusing brings, going to that level.
Yes, it definitely makes the whole experiential process more central. The one more thing I would say about existentialism, and then I'd love to hear more from your side, is this is something that I think existentialism offers usefully to focusing oriented people. And that is, again, the phenomenology, in that there's this constant opening up or almost deconstructive sort of approach to assumptions. And the assumption that the client shouldn't feel depressed or shouldn't be unhappy. From the existential perspective, everything is welcome. You don't know how a person should live. None of us has, well, as far as we know, none of us has lived before. This is the first time for all of us. And the existential tradition really grasps that and says, we don't know how it should be. And we're not going to try to twist it in some particular direction. We want to embrace all of the person's being, or all of being, not just the person's, because if you're working at the existential level, you're intimately involved in all of the aspects of human existence, as much the ones that are joyful and lovely to share as the ones that take us into a profound feeling of despair that might be very welcome to feel. To be able to be with someone and to acknowledge something like despair or inconsolable grief or something, to be able to name it and to have that feeling with someone else who's also open to feeling it with you and also feeling their own version of it at the same time. And just sitting there and thinking, okay, so this is part of what it is to be a human being.
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes I think the focusing world needs some of that. The culture needs some opening or expanding in that way, I would say.
Yeah, there's a delicate line between the basic philosophical principle of carrying forward, of life wanting more life, of things opening up, of growth wanting to happen, of healing being a natural part of not only human living, but all living, that life wants that, and that we don't have to make the person grow. The person wants to grow. It's like a garden, and we're there in the garden. That principle that the psychoanalysts call developmental thrust, it's in that same direction. The development wants to happen, gets confused with more superficial positivity.
Exactly.
So when I'm in dialogue with the positive psychologists, people, that tradition, I always want to say, well, with focusing, it isn't about separating positive from negative. It's about what's really there, and what's really there. The worst of what's really there opens up to growth. So if the client says, I hate myself and I want to kill myself, and you may not see me next week, and you say, well, some part of you is feeling, if you soft pedal it, it's not going to have an impact. If you say, I could feel that hatred and that determination to just kill that one, that's going to have an impact. That's the being on its side, but also that from the psychoanalytic point of view, trauma is what's indigestible. And if you're avoiding the indigestible parts of life, then it never becomes digestible. If you can be in it and say it and say that that's despair, utter despair, then it becomes more digestible, because as a system you could digest it.
Exactly. I think what you're pointing to partly is just the extreme importance of relationship with those kinds of very difficult experiences. I want to just give one really brief example.
Right.
When I used to work at the hospital, I remember being called to this young woman. She's, I think, in her mid or late 30s, and she had 2 young children. And she had had some kind of a brain aneurysm or something, and she had just collapsed and ended up, woke up in the hospital on a rehab ward. And when I went to see her, she was totally despondent, nothing to live for. The physios and everyone else that have been trying to cajole her into getting up and getting her body moving again, they're saying, but what about your kids? What about your husband? What about? And it's just like nothing touched her. So they called me, and I went and I listened to her, and I just listened to her. And she was basically saying, how can I go on living knowing that can happen? There was no reason for it, and there was no guarantee that it wouldn't happen again.
Yes.
And I just listened to that, and I really let myself feel it. And I remember walking back to my office thinking, at any moment I could drop like she did.
Yeah.
I really felt the fragility of that, and just my whole body kind of felt like sand. And I went back thinking, well, I'm going to have to make space to see her regularly for the next couple of weeks. I went back 2 days later and was met in the corridor by the physios saying, what did you do? What did you say to her? And I came back and I saw her. She was up. She was doing the physio. She was getting better. She was, bright, looking forward to going home. And I was just flabbergasted.
That's amazing.
What? And she said, it's just because you listened to what it was really like. She was able to even say that to me, that's what it was.
Wow.
No one else dared listen to it.
Yeah.
Everybody else would kind of listen a little bit and then take a shortcut towards, but it's going to be okay, blah, blah, blah.
Yes,
and
yes.
It didn't do it for her. She needed somebody to follow her all the way down, and then she could find her way back.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
It really stuck with me, the power of that.
It's a wonderful example. And it seems to me that deep belief that isn't just a conceptual belief, but a moment-to-moment trying out, a phenomenological connection, that the forward movement is organic and natural, enables us to listen, really listen, and feel the hard stuff. Because without that faith in forward movement, in opening up, in development, I think it's impossible for us to bear it.
The faith that it can, even if it doesn't.
Yes, that it's meant to, that
Yes.
it's life's way. That I often will quote Jean saying, every human experience has implicit inherent carrying forward in it.
Yeah.
Movement in it, that there's something that wants to open.
Yes. And I want to just say, he might be wrong. I have always found that to be true. And it helps me look for the life that is peeking out of even the most difficult experience. It helps me notice it. But for me, it's also still empirical to see, is that true here in this particular case? So I'm open to, maybe tomorrow life will be different. Maybe tomorrow the carrying forward will stop. And some other strange thing we've never encountered before will start. we have no way of knowing. But the one thing that I do want to say is, with that particular woman, it wasn't even my faith in that, although sometimes it certainly is, exactly as you say. What it was that everything I could think of saying that was, trying to make it better, it just felt so cheap and chintzy, and I could feel my whole body kind of went, don't, you'll make yourself sick if you say that. But I just didn't say any of it.
Uh-huh.
I felt the impulse to try to make it better, and I felt how wrong it would be to do that. Just was right in me.
You were being informed by your own body, your own deep inherent authenticity
Yes.
of your sensing that that life in you that said, no, don't, put on a happy face or something.
Exactly. Or another way of saying it is, maybe I was actually really being guided by the kind of interaction that was really needed, even though I wasn't consciously aware of it.
Yes. Yeah. We're running out of time, but I want to say there that one of the things that I've been really intrigued with is taking the concept of interaction first and and really spelling it out in the therapeutic arena, and that being guided by what is needed is what I call a felt sense of the us, a felt sense of where the system needs to go, a felt sense of not just my felt sense or your felt sense, but what where the flow of life is for the us in that moment, where we can both breathe, the fresh air for the system. And I think that takes a particular kind of cultivation to be paying attention not only to the client and then to yourself, but to the system and what's trying to happen there, and that the interaction has a life of its own. Jean will say that there are two people, but there's one interaction.
Yeah.
And then to bring that forward and to say, well, what does the interaction need? What do we need? brings a whole other wide field that's so intriguing to me.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think that's really true. How you can actually be providing the kind of interaction that the client is saying never happens for them. But the fact that you're actually providing it in that moment means that they can actually explore that it never happens for them, even though it's happening right then.
Right, that's right, exactly. Yes. And then to be aware that it isn't only about the what you're saying, which is exploring that it never happens, but that it's happening in the moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
You are living it.
Yeah. 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 Exactly that.